Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the fifth session of the webinar, Thriving in Substance Use Disorders, Service Delivery in the Post-COVID Era. My name is Andrea Havler, and I will be facilitating this class. As you all know, the Center for Substance Use Training and Telementoring, CSTAT, created this webinar in tandem with the Texas Health and Human Commission, with the intention of training our behavioral health force on how to manage, mitigate, and communicate during health crises such as COVID-19. And to that end, we put together a team of leaders in infectious diseases and addiction medicine so they can help us navigate COVID-19 in the context of COVID-19 and substance use disorders. But before we start, I just want to welcome you again and remind you that this session is being recorded for later distribution. If you need captionings for this class, you may navigate to the bottom part of your Zoom windows and click on the captionings feature. Remember, when you attend this webinar, you are eligible for CMEs and CEs. And there is a difference. If you want CMEs, all you have to do is text that code that we will share during this class today before 12 at midnight. If you want CEs, and with that I'm referring specifically to the certificates that we create for behavioral health professionals. For those, you will wait approximately 3 weeks before you receive them, assuming, of course, that you completed the post-session survey. So please be on the lookout for that email with that survey right after this class. And today we have Dr. Luz Maria Garcini. Dr. Garcini is going to be talking about grief and loss after COVID-19. And Dr. Garcini is an associate professor here at UT Health San Antonio. She is also a doctor on clinical psychology from San Diego State University in California. And she is a faculty scholar for the Baker Institute for Public Policies at Rice University. Dr. Garcini, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you. Thank you for taking part of this webinar. How are you doing today?
Thank you. Thank you very much for making that space. I'm doing great. I'm very excited. And just a minor correction. I'm an assistant professor and director of community and public health at the Kinder Institute at Rice University. I used to be at UT Health San Antonio, but
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for correcting that. Thank you. All right. So, Dr. Garcini, whenever you're ready, you can start walking us through your presentation.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
So I appreciate the help navigating the slides. So can we, yes. Next slide, please. I think these are just some disclosures from the program. You're probably familiar for those of you who have attended the program before. And the learning objectives for today, the first is to conceptualize grief as a universal yet unique process. The other one is to identify what are some symptoms of disenfranchised grief. We will talk about what that means, including what might be some cultural and contextual determinants. And then building some strategies to address symptoms of disenfranchised grief, particularly from a strength-based perspective within the context of substance use. Next slide, please. As I go through also, if you have, I will making certain stops, but if you have any questions, I prefer that you make those questions as we go along the presentation, because sometimes it is harder to ask them all the way at the end. So if you have questions, please put them on the chat and they can ask me the questions as we go. So probably not surprising to you, we know that during COVID-19, dying and loss became at the forefront of a lot of people's life, probably the majority of us, because if it was not the loss of a loved one that was close to us, we at least knew of someone who has lost a loved person. And the other thing, in having navigate this area of grief throughout the pandemic, we also realized that there was more than the loss of a loved one. So there was the loss of social networks, the loss of connections, the loss of jobs, the loss of housings. So loss became this very, very big stressor that at some point we were forced to deal with it in a different way. But we know, however, that dying and loss are part of life. And yet we fear them. We don't often think in our everyday life about the things that we're about to lose, and it becomes a very frightening event. Yet the good news is that because we're beautifully made, we're very resilient. And on the majority, people can overcome loss with time in a very healthy way. However, that's not the case for everybody. And we'll be talking about what are some of those instances that present bigger challenges for us. And we know that for certain people, substance use can be thought of as a coping strategy in the face of loss. However, we know that substance use can lead to detrimental consequences. Among some of the participants that attended our sessions during the COVID pandemic, we found some people that were saying, well, all I could do was to numb the sensations or the stress that I was having through substance use. And the result was a stronger feeling of isolation. Some of them, as a result of that, started losing their jobs. And all those compounded losses that take place become bigger in the midst of losing a loved one or losing something that is important to you. Next slide, please. So in the midst of the pandemic, as you know, I remember very, very clearly, I was working at UT Health San Antonio back then, and we were completely shut down. There was a sense of uncertainty. We did not know for how long this was going to be. We did not know how bad this was going to be. But what was filtering to us was seeing all those images in the TV of loss, of people losing loved ones, of people dying in the hospital alone, all over the world. And it became very scary. At that point, we were, UT Health San Antonio was also serving and stepping up to serve all South Texas. And so several community partners reached out to us and said, can we do something for historically marginalized communities across South Texas so that we can reach out and give them some psychoeducational information for dealing with loss and grief? And that's when PATS Sendero started. PATS in Spanish means Sendero or PATS, or because we wanted to build something that will help people remain strong in their values, in the things that they knew. So we start to conceptualize it from the dual process model of bereavement. And basically what this model, in a nutshell, what it says is that you need to address loss by focusing on processing what that experience of loss is to you, but also alternating between a sense of restoration. So once what you learn about your loss, how can you help to restore yourself and adjust so that you can keep moving forward in life? And we'll go over what are some of these aspects later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So what we did is to make it accessible for people, we started putting webinars, and these webinars were done twice a month live, and then eventually we started recording it. And if you want to access them, the webinars are still available at UT Health San Antonio at the REACH Center for Research to Advance Community Health, along with the book list that I'm going to talk about. But the webinars were a two-part bereavement webinar series. And we did two parts based actually on the community feedback, on the participants' feedback, because people felt that there is too much information. Now, today, I'm going to outline to you what that entire two-part look like. But if you want to take it a little bit slower, you can go back to the webinar series. Because loss is hard to process all at one time. So you need to do it at your own pace. You need to make sure and notice how your body is feeling. What are some of the reactions that you're having so that you're not having the overwhelming feelings that might lead you to cope inadequately through your grief. We also try to focus on grief in a non-stigmatizing, addressing different cultural variations, and also the contextual issues that affect people differently. But in a nutshell, the program addresses three things. The first one is, how do we process love and grief? What are some of those basic skills that you need to learn what your grief looks like to you? The second one is, how do we build evidence-based coping strategies, skills so that you can deal with it even in the midst of the storm? And then how do we promote resilience in the face of adversity so that you can adjust to the loss and keep moving forward with your life, not meaning that you forget the lessons learned or the person that you lost, but that how do you continue to celebrate their memories moving forward? Next slide, please. Next slide. And this is the booklet that is available at the Reach Center at UT Health in San Antonio. And basically what we wanted is, a lot of the participants were describing, we did not have the booklet in the first webinars. So what you're seeing is the product of having received the community feedback and incorporated to make something better that will work for people. But what people were saying is, when you're in the midst of grief, it is really, really hard to think or to keep focus. It's almost like your attention is all over the place. It changes throughout the day from one day to another. So they needed something tangible, that one key idea, very simple exercises that could keep them thinking about what they were learning from the workshops. So this is why we developed the Paz Senderos booklet, and it's available in English and Spanish. And it provides very practical steps of exercises that people could do one at a time to go through those three different facets that I mentioned to you. And it encouraged moving people at their own pace. We have several people who attended the webinars monthly. I mean, it was the same information presented every month, but the more people realized that they could come back and listen to the same information, they felt like they were able to process it and take the most advantage of it. Next slide, please. But so the very beginning is about, to start processing your grief, you need to define what is grief for you. And we know that grief is a natural response to a significant loss, to any loss, and that it is a painful experience. And the loss of someone that you love is probably the most painful experience we'll have to deal in life. One of the other things that I like to emphasize is that it's unique in presentation. There's not a prescribed way of experiencing grief. There's not a one model fits all grief. We know also that before, we used to think from the work of Dr. Kubler-Ross of the stages of grief, we know that that's not necessarily the case anymore, and that there's no prescribed step that one thing follows the next, and this is telling me that I'm getting better. But that is very unique in your presentation, even within people within the same family. Your grief is going to be very different to the one of the loved ones around, to the one of someone else that you have heard before, in duration and in what that experience means to them. It varies depending on the amount of support that is available, on the type of coping strategies that you have used in the past to deal with stress. So for instance, if one of your salient coping strategies in the past to deal with stress has been engaging in substance use, you're more likely to use those same strategies to deal with grief and loss. It depends on the nature of the loss, how that loss was experienced. For instance, if it was sudden, or if it was unexpected, or if it was of a younger person that is not supposed to be dying. All of that is going to influence how you experience your grief. And ironically, as unique as it is a universal experience in that everyone is going to have to go through that. And sometimes people say, well, I don't like to hear that because we don't think that it's something that someday we are going to have to lose the people that we love. And sometimes the people that love us are going to have to face our own loss. So ironically, as unique as it is, it's a universal experience. And I think that helped some of our participants, and even within my own grief experiences, to kind of realize that it is a universal process and that we're not alone in this process. Next slide, please. So why do we grieve? And this is a beautiful quote from Dr. Eric, from a psychologist, that in a nutshell, what it conveys is that we grieve because it is the price we have to pay for loving. The more you love, the more painful that is going to be the loss. And it's understandable. So at some point in one of the conversations that we were having with our participants, we found out that are we willing to lose that ability to love just to preserve ourselves from that pain? Or do we know that in loving, there will be a point that we will have to pay that price? And there's no easy answer to this, but I think that sometimes we'll talk about reframing our own helpful thoughts. If we start thinking that that sense of grieving can also be a celebration of that possibility of love that got to our loss, then we might be in the right path towards reframing that sense of grief so that we can adjust to the loss. Next slide, please. So how long does grief last? Again, this is a painful idea, but the reality, Dr. Kluber-Ross gives us this beautiful quote that says, the reality is that you will grieve forever. That's a very scareful thought because grief is very painful, and that you will not get over the loss of a loved one. However, you will learn to live with that. And it is in those lessons learned that you will become stronger, that you learn more about yourself, and that you can also learn to celebrate that love that was given to you, that you will learn to celebrate the lessons learned from that relationship that you had that will help you move forward so that you can pass it on to someone else in need. But you will heal and you will rebuild yourself around that loss. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Not sure you want to be the same, nor would you want to, because that is, if you really think about it this way, that is a way of honoring that love. Next slide. So I'm going to stop for a minute to see if we have any questions. Let me know if we have questions. If not, I can continue to move forward.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we have a couple of questions here. So someone is asking specifically when could they find some of these webinars that you're talking about?
Yes, they are, I believe on the last slide, I have the webpage, and hopefully the slides will be made available for the participants. There is the website where they can click on it, and it will take them to the page at the Center for Research to Advance Community Health at UT Health San Antonio, where they can find that and the booklets.
Yes, absolutely. We want to reiterate that we are going to send the didactic materials to all the participants. So I think for now we can continue. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So then we started to continue to think and continue to define the process of grieving. So what is the grieving process? As I mentioned to you, we used to believe that they were complex phases, but that they had an order. And now what we know through so many years of research experience is that it really doesn't look one specific way, and that you might experience different phases all over the place. So some of our participants were telling us, well, some days I feel better than others, and then all of a sudden an anniversary comes and it takes me back to square one. So you might experience shock or denial, particularly depending if, for instance, the death was sudden. You might experience that sense of a shock that will have a lot of detrimental emotional outbursts and feelings of sadness and overwhelming sensations. You will experience pain. You might also experience sense of guilt and shame. We'll talk a little bit more later today. You might feel anger or frustration. You might feel sadness or loneliness, anxiety, despair. And there'll be times when you feel acceptance. But there is no specific order. One day you might feel angry and frustrated, and the next day you might feel sad and lonely. And then pass a month, and then you feel like you're getting better, and that you feel like, okay, I'm finally coming to terms with it and I'm accepting it. And then after that, it only takes a trigger, a reminder, a picture, watching a picture, and you go back to feeling sense of anger. So know that those waves of ups and downs, remember the processing of loss, the dual model of bereavement, the processing of love and the restoration part, alternate. And eventually the goal is for those swings to become a little bit stable. That doesn't mean that you're not going to experience over time. I mean, we had participants who said, I lost my daughter, and how can you get over the loss of a daughter, right? I lost my daughter 20 years ago, and every year when it's her birthday, I go back to feeling angry. It's almost back to reliving everything of that year. And if we go back to the quote that I previously read, right? You will grieve for life. It's how you learned to live with that. Because the truth is that life will put us on our knees. It's how we get up that will continues to be able to help us cope with these complex phases that will probably alternate for a very long time. Next slide, please. Yet, in that process of trying to achieve the balance across those stages, there is also the complicated grief process. So what is complicated grief? At the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned to you that locally, because we are beautifully made to be resilient, that most people can eventually adapt to grieving. But there are some instances where it becomes harder. So complicated grief is a long-lasting, severe, and debilitating condition that it's after 6 months to a year to make a clinical diagnosis. But I would say is when people have lost, the biggest description that we've heard is people have lost their will of life, their will of living. Particularly after a year, they stop eating, they stop taking care of themselves. They're literally letting themselves die with their loved one. And about 10 to 15% of people develop complicated grief. And complicated grief increases, unfortunately, the risk of substance use disorder. As I mentioned before, for those people who have used substances to deal with stress in their life, in the midst of someone so strong as the loss of a loved one, they're probably going to go back and try to use that as a coping strategy without knowing that that's going to interfere with a healthy grieving process and increase the risk for developing complicated grief that will take them into a spiraling down. So it is important to seek help early, because the good news, I know I'm giving you a lot of, kind of sad and not very hopeful news, but the good news is that we have treatments. We have treatments that can help people restore that sense of self and find effective adaptive strategies so that they can get back on their feet and move forward to honor the lives of the people that they lost. Next slide, please. So next, remember I talked to you about 3 points that are very, very important in coping with grief. The first one is to understand your grieving process, right? What does that process looks like to you, and what is the grieving process? But the second one is, how do you build strategies so that you can keep moving? And the first thing for this is to learn to identify what your grief looks like. what are your symptoms of grief that you need to start identifying? Because anything that you can measure can be managed. So sometimes it takes about journal writing. How does grief feels in your body? For some of us, particularly certain cultures, when we don't like to talk about mental health symptoms, we start developing a lot of somatic symptoms. So some of the things that we hear is, I have this chronic pain in my body that started, migraine headaches, stomach aches. I feel this ill sensation all over. So as in reflecting about this, we always ask people, in the past, when you have lost someone or something important to you, how did that feel in your body, so that they can start seeing if that's their current experience. Next, we have the thoughts, the mind. What are some of the thoughts that come to mind? Are you having that catastrophizing negative self-talk in your head? For instance, you can't do that. You won't be able to survive without your loved one. For people engaging in substance use disorder, you will never be able to get over this. You have to continue to use substances because you have failed in the past. You will not do it again. What are some of those emotions that are coming up? And that's probably the hardest one, because as we sat through listening through many of the grief stories, people just often they just said, I'm just not feeling like myself, or I just don't feel well. And when we started to trying to ask them, try to describe that, to put it into words what that looks like, it became very difficult. So we started relying on emojis, like using similar to what we use in the phone, and pointing at it and then saying, what does that emoji looks like? What does it feel like to you? And I'm going to tell you that becomes key, because understanding your emotions is so important so that you can communicate to the people, to your loved ones, what is it that you need so they can help you, they can provide you with the right support. If you're feeling angry, you need to know what that anger looks like in your body. How does that anger feels in your body? What are those thoughts that are feeding that anger? What are you likely to do? What are some of those behaviors that you're going to engage in when you feel angry? And notice here, the substance use might be one of those. And the minute you start noticing and getting to know yourself better, you'll be able to identify what are some coping strategies that you can use. And then we start asking people, what are some of those behaviors that you start seeing more when you're facing your symptoms of grief? Are you isolating yourself, or you don't want to be alone? Are you just launching into a group? And sometimes it might not be the right group, right? For instance, for people who engage in substance use disorders, who have hang around the same group of people that are going to be more likely to say, hey, have a drink so that you can relax, so that you don't have to face the loss of your loved one. Hey, you'll feel better if you have this drink with me, only one drink together. Right. So what are those behaviors that you're trying or relying on in order for you to feel, to deal with your symptoms of grief, but knowing that they're not might be the ideal ways of coping with it? Spiritually, what has happened to that inner voice? Are you losing your faith in your higher power or in God? Or are you anchoring yourself in it? Are you sleeping? Are you eating? Are you taking care of yourself, or have you forgotten about that? So again, the first thing is to know yourself, to put into words what is happening to you. Next slide. And this one, I already kind of talked a little bit about it. Recognizing and validating your emotions is very important, and observing them without judgment. We tend to, for instance, in the case of anger, this was one of the most difficult ones, because people were saying, well, I don't want to feel anger, at my spouse for having left me. You know, I want to feel compassion. And then they start putting all these judgment things in their head that can lead or increase the chances of feeling guilt or shame. So how can you engage in mindful exercises, perhaps meditation, that you can sit down and really feel and look at your emotions, but the most important thing is without judging them, by owning them. And trying to understand, what does your emotions mean to you? And I wish I could give you the answer, but this is the beauty of embarking in your own self-exploration, because only you will find those answers that fit who you are. And then normalize your emotions. We heard a lot from people, well, I should be feeling better. It's been over a year. How come I'm not getting better, right? And all those shoulds do not help with normalizing your emotions. You have to be patient with yourself and allow enough time for you to heal in this painful process. But know that one of the most helpful I guess, pieces of wisdom that we can give people is to ask people, if you were in someone else's shoes, who have just lost someone who meant everything to them, who was their partner for 50 years, wouldn't you feel the same emotions? What would you say to someone going through the same loss? And usually that is very helpful for people to be able to tap into their own sense of compassion. Because if you can have compassion for someone else, then the question is, why not turn that compassion towards yourself? Next slide, please. Also, very, very important is to identify your triggers, right? And again, this is an individual process. So for some people, it could be a picture of your loved one, that all of a sudden you feel like, okay, you know, I'm doing better today. And you turn around and you look at that picture, and all of a sudden you feel this crushing sadness, right? Other senses of triggers is, for some people, is not eating or not sleeping. If you don't sleep, you're probably going to be more on edge, or less feeling like you're less able to cope with all of those overwhelming emotions. What are some of those triggering emotions that are going to push you to rely on a drink, or to rely on going and smoking more, on using drugs, that could help you momentarily numb those emotions, so that feel that you can continue to breathe better? However, that is very short lasting. And then what happens is, after the effect of the substance goes away, then the overwhelming emotion comes, and even bigger. So it's important for you to start writing and identifying what are those triggers for you. And there can be so many things. It can be celebrations, it can be birthdays, it can be holidays, it can be reminders of the house, sometimes not at the very beginning of the loss, but eventually over time, we start working with people so that they start cleaning the space, removing, at least temporarily, all those triggers that are likely to put them back into a place where they don't feel equipped to deal with their grief and their loss. Next slide, please. The other one is to build your priorities. One of the first things that we hear from people is that when you're in the midst of so much pain, you forget about yourself. So it is even forgetting about the basic things like eating, showering, taking care of your sleep patterns, making sure that you schedule times during the day to rest. People stop doing that. And people don't realize that when you do those things, when you stop taking care of yourself, your body becomes more prone to the effects of stress. So it's almost like a vicious cycle. So because at the same time, it's so hard to focus your attention on your priorities and what you need, this is when we start telling people it's time for you to write a simple list, to write 3 things that you can put perhaps in front of that place that you're going to see every day, which is the mirror in your bathroom, as to what are some very easy, simple things that you can do to continue moving forward. And things that you can do that will set you up for success. So you don't want to put, a task that might seem too big when you don't have the energy, but perhaps you can put have a lunch or have a snack every 3 hours, set an alarm so that you make sure that you're eating, that you're maintaining your health, schedule a nap or schedule a meditation session or go out for a walk for 15 minutes. The power of walks when you are in the midst of a really stressful emotional state, or when a trigger all of a sudden hits you, right? And that's when you start thinking, should I just go and put that drink in me? I recommend go take a walk. Go take a walk around the block and see if when you come back, that's still there. Sometimes people say the power of just changing sceneries, changing settings can be so helpful. And then you have the pressure of the family. We heard this as well, right? So I stopped taking care of my family. But what we say is you cannot take care of someone else unless you take care of yourself. It reminds me of that message when we get on the plane that we hear about the mask of oxygen, right? You need to put your mask first before you can help even the child that you might have with you. So start thinking and making a list of those priorities. And then all the tasks related to the loss that are really hard to do. And those don't need to be done right away. For some people, they do. For instance, we had participants who have lost their spouses that says, now I need to all of a sudden learn to manage the finances. We had a business that we were managing. So I need to know how to do that, and I don't know how to do it. I need to all of a sudden fix the things in the house that he used to fix. So you don't have to at this moment to do some of those things, but that eventually you can start including them in the priority list. Next slide, please. Setting boundaries and limits is also very, very important. And it is important to know, and this varies a lot by cultural context, that assertiveness is not aggression, that it is important to be honest, respectful, and direct to people, and that it is okay to say no without guilt. Sometimes people want to help, and people sometimes don't know how to help. So, I heard it from a mother that kept saying, that her friends kept coming to her and saying, it's going to get better. It's going to get better. We're praying for you. And she said, that was not helping me. And I did not know how to tell them, leave me alone, that I don't want to hear that right now. So how can you start learning how to set your boundaries? What boundaries and what limits do you need to take care of yourself so that you can take care of your priorities? And be patient with yourself and practice setting those boundaries and limits, perhaps with the people that you trust the most at first. Next slide, please. Also important in building strategy is fostering your sources of support. And it's important to identify because we often tend to think of support in one straight way rather than the different ways of support that might exist. So things, for instance, when you lose someone, you might need someone to give you instructional support, like how to learn how to do things, right? What are the first steps that I need to do to arrange a funeral? What do I need to do to pay the bills if I was never the person who did the bills? How do I take care of insurance if I did not know anything about that? So that's one type of support. The other one is emotional support, the person that might give you a hug, that person that might hold your hand, that person that can sit with you in silence, but just being there for you. And those two sources of support might be very different. So one people might be able to be the one that goes and buys you groceries because you don't even have the energy to do that and bring it to you. Another person might be the one that goes to you, to your support group, or to get you into the right treatment. And another one might be that one that gives you a hug. So start thinking about the people around you. Who can you ask for the specific type of support that you need? And in what way do you need it? Next slide, please. The other one, I already mentioned a little bit about changing unhelpful thoughts. This is not easy by no means. However, it starts with insight. It starts by paying attention to that voice. You know, usually when we go to bed at night, when all the voices, the TV is down, sleeping with the TV on is the worst thing you can do. But when the TV is off and you're just there in your bed, what are the thoughts that come up? And that's when you can start identifying those unhelpful thoughts. Are those thoughts that are self-defeating, that are telling you you won't be able to deal with this, or you haven't succeeded in your efforts in the past, so you're a failure, you won't do it. And if those are unhelpful thoughts, start finding evidence that can fight that information back. When have been times in your life that you have succeeded? What are those thoughts? Because sometimes those self-defeating thoughts become so big that it makes us forget about our ability to have bounce back. Next slide, please. So I'm going to stop here to see if we have any questions before we move to the last section of adjusting.
Yes, Dr. Garcini, so far we don't have any questions related to the presentation in itself. So if you want to, let's continue. And at the end, we're going to address a couple more of comments and questions. All right? Thank
Okay,
you.
wonderful. Thank you. So the last piece, right? So the first one was learning to identify and process your grief, letting to know what that grief experience looks like for you. The other one is building the skills that you need to survive in the moment, to continue to put one foot in front of another. And the other one, learning to adjust to a new life. Learning to adjust to a new life without your loved one. Again, it doesn't mean that you're letting go of the memory. It means that you continue to move on in life, celebrating that person that you lost, celebrating that opportunity that you had to have loved that person and the lessons learned from that relationship. And the first one is to develop hope, to find something to believe in, whatever that is. For some people, it's rooted in their faith or in their spirituality. For some people, it's believing in their own abilities to move forward. Finding meaning is important. I would say it's essential to your healing. You need to find a meaning, and only you can find what that experience would look like. And then finding a purpose is essential to move forward. You need to find out a reasoning to move forward. And sometimes it's because you had to go through that path, because someday someone will cross your path that will need your words of wisdom in order to be able to embark in their own healing way. And I can tell you, this happened a lot through our participants during the pandemic when they say, I did not understand why I had to go through this, except, my niece just came to me after the loss of my brother. And now I knew that my purpose is to help her walk through it because I already walked through it. And that is a very powerful experience if we think about how grief is a universal process that eventually, at some point in life, is going to touch every one of us. So I love this quote from Richard Paul Evans that said, it is often in the darker skies that we can see the brightest stars. Next slide, please. So the other one, this is about dealing with guilt. And this is probably the most painful and devastating emotions that you can deal with grief, that can increase your risk also for complicated grief. So it's important, if your experience is guilt, to know where it's coming from. Now, guilt is a common experience of loss, and people experience it for many, many different reasons. Whether it is, I did not spend enough time with my loved one, or sometimes people who have lost their loved ones after a long-term illness can say, I feel relief now that they're lost and I shouldn't be feeling like that. So then they feel guilty about feeling that relief. Sometimes for people who were struggling with substance use disorders that created a lot of friction, for instance, in a relationship, and then the person got, you experienced the loss and you're still dealing with substance use, that guilt about how did I not get cleaner in time so that my person could see it? It's also dealing with a lot of guilt. But it is essential in order for you to heal, to find ways of letting go of that guilt. And again, those ways look different for different people. Some people write letters. Some people make amends. And at the end, my last slide will give you some ideas about honoring your loved one. Some people decide to embark on treatment, to give treatment one more try. To see if you can do it in honor of your loved one. But it is important first to recognize the guilt, what that guilt means, where does this come from, and what are some ways that you can let go. Next one. This is also important, is building upon your values and qualities. So identifying what are those things that are important to you and that are rooted on that, your beliefs and who you are as a person. We all have some positive qualities in us. Sometimes they get a little turned down, particularly with those voices that tell us you won't do it, you have failed in the past, you will fail again. But we all have survived something in our lives. So it is important, so during those hard times, that we start reflecting about what have been those instances in life when we have fall on our knees and get back up? What did you do? What helped you push through? Because it is very, very likely that you can tap into those qualities to be able to walk again, even in the midst of this painful loss. And to spend some time healing. Don't rush to feel like I should feel feeling better, right? Root yourself in those values, in those qualities. Do a self-exploration and take your time healing and nurturing them. Next slide. Give me a second. I see a message.
Yeah, Dr. Garcini, just wanted to let you know, I know we are approaching the end of the didactics. I'm sorry, I'm trying to
Yes.
use my camera. Yes, I know we're approaching to the end, so just wanted to let you know that we're close to that time where ideally we should be closing our presentation, and we do have a couple of questions for you already. All right,
Perfect.
thank you.
I can finish in 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
So the next one is tell your story. It is important. There is so much power when people tell their story, and you never know who might be benefiting from hearing what you have to say. Next slide. Here is a list of different ways in which people can honor their loved ones. Remember, we talked about the importance of celebrating that the lessons learned and the ability to love. So some people engage in praying, dedicating your praying time, relaxation, meditation, thinking about that person that you love, and process some healing, building things, planting a tree. Some people say cooking their favorite meals. So hopefully you'll have the slide so that you can see all of the different ways of honoring your loved one. And you're going to have to find what that one is going to be the most powerful for you. Next slide. And in closing, I'd like to leave you with words of wisdom from Winnie the Pooh, that little bear that has so much wisdom, that it says, if ever there is tomorrow when we're not together, there is something you must always remember, that you are braver than you believe, that you are stronger than you seem, and that you are smarter than you think. But the most important thing is, even if you are apart from your loved ones, they will always be with you. Thank you.
Wow, this has been a very enlightening presentation. Definitely a topic where all of us, one way or another, we connect to, which is grief and loss. And we have here, someone is asking, is there a compiled list of resources in which we can find information about grief?
Yes, I believe I can look it up, and it might be also at the Reach Center. where we compile a list of resources in the midst of the pandemic. Now, I don't know how many of those organizations continue to exist, but I would say the first place to start, if you're a faith-based person, to go to your faith-based institution. We work very closely with them, and they often have support groups that were non-denominational for people to access.
Thank you, Dr. Garcini. And also, many or most of our participants are part of the behavioral health workforce. What would be, in your opinion, which ones would be some typical signs of a person who is going through complicated grief or complex grief, as you call it? What are those signs or telling signs that they could help them to identify when a person is going through that?
Yeah, I think again, it's difficult to pinpoint it because it's different about everyone. And I think when we want to see a list, we might miss on something else. And so I'm not a fan of lists, but the biggest one for me is a loss and a will to live. A person who has lost the will to live, that they just literally wish they were dead. And the other one is a person who's not eating, who has lost a significant amount of weight, who's not sleeping, who's not taking care of the everyday basic life sustainable activities. That will be a very, very big sign.
Thank you. And there is a comment here from Aiden that says, I have learned before that perceived support, the idea that somebody can help you, is a great way of support, since other times, for other types of support, for instance, instructional, emotional, can mismatch the needs that someone has. Would you say that perceived support is ideal when helping a grieving person as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it might vary. There might be, this is what I say. I think the self-reflection process is so important, because there might be days that people say, I want to be alone. I don't want anyone. And at that point, the support might look different. But if you think, yeah, I know that I can reach out to people and call them on the phone and they're going to be there, or just say, bring me groceries today because I don't feel like going out.
Right.
Whereas another day, you might feel like you want to be surrounded with people, or you might want to start venturing out into a space and perhaps meet with a group of friends. But having that awareness of who is your support group is so important. And for some people, often we tend to think that family, immediately when we think support system, we think of family. But I can tell you that in a lot of our participants, we say, the support that I did not need it was my family, because there were certain boundaries that were bridged, that people were saying, well, you should be doing better. You should be, you need to try harder, right? Whereas often reaching out to other people, strangers who have walked the same path, provide great sources of support. When we were doing the webinars, actually, the people attending the webinars started doing their own support groups, and then they started meeting each other through the webinars, and then started putting together their Zooms in the midst of the pandemic and talking about that. And it was important for them because they share an experience, yet they were strangers in it.
That's interesting. It's true. Sometimes strangers can be more of a help for a person than someone who's too close to you. Maybe because that person is too close to your pain and they care for you and they hate to see you suffering, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And just before we start with announcements, just one quick question. If you could briefly make that relationship between grieving, loss, and substance use. We know the substances can be actually of great value to help a person cope with grief, but also they can aggravate or exacerbate loss and grief. So how could we put that relationship between those two?
I think it's all about the self-exploration part. What is the role the substance use is playing in facilitating or interfering in your healthy coping, right? And I think this is when it will vary by person. If you're going to have a cup of wine one day to help you deal because you had a really overwhelming day. Perhaps that is okay. But if that's becoming a pattern that is sinking you more into the depression, into an inability to cope, if as a result of that you start experiencing other losses, the loss of your job, the loss of your functional ability, your loss of relate to others, then perhaps it's time to seek professional help to find a different path or a different way of coping.
Absolutely. And just to let you know, we have a comment here. Someone says, this presentation has been awesome. Thank you. I just lost 3 family members in the past 3 months, including my mother. This was right on time. I learned to advocate for yourself, meaning not being afraid or too stubborn to ask for help and ask to be with someone else during holidays and so on. So those are great feedbacks from our learners. So thank you once again, Dr. Garcini. I think that at this time, probably we can move to the announcements. We want to thank you again for an amazing presentation. I know it's a huge topic and it might be worth a second part, but I think you covered very, very important aspects and parts of the loss and grieving process. Thank you, Dr. Garcini, once again. And to remind our learners also, we here at Center for Substance Use Training and Telementoring CSTAT, we offer technical assistance. And technical assistance can be anything. It can be support with clinical or organizational cases. It can be connections to other organizations and groups of the communities, or distribution of certain medications in Texas or locally. So if you need technical assistance, please go to our website. We're sharing the link with all of you right now. And there is a form. All forms for TA or technical assistance will be answered within 3 days. Next, please. And for CMEs and CMEs, remember, for CMEs, you're going to be texting code ATTEND 100-957-93 today before midnight. And after that, you should be receiving your CMEs via text. However, if there are any issues, no worries. You can send us an email here at bewelltexas@utesca.edu and we can help you. For CMEs, and right there, I'm talking about the certificates, please answer the post-session survey. We are sharing it with you right now, and we'll be sending it after the session. And we'll be sending your certificates in approximately 3 weeks. So give it at least between 2 or 3 weeks for us to send the certificates. Thank you. Next. And this is very interesting session. It's called Navigating Recovery in Rural Texas. This is going to take place on Thursday, May the 30th. If you want to sign for this Texas session, this is one of those sessions that we offer our participants preparing on when we are on our way to go to our big, huge conference that many of you have attended. So this is the first Texas conference. You can go to texas.org/sessions. Next, please. And this webinar continues, of course, and next month on Tuesday, June 18, we're going to be talking about communicating during a public health emergency. If you want to register, please go to our cstat.utesca.edu/COVID-19, and you can register for the session. This will be a continuation of this 8-part webinars, Thriving in Substance Use Disorders Service Delivery. Next. Okay, so it looks like we are completed our announcements and our didactics. We want to thank you once again for being here. Remember, we're going to be sending the post-session survey and the didactic material. This session will be in our Be Well Texas YouTube channel soon, so be on the lookout for that at the end of the month. Thank you again for being here, and we'll see you all next month on June 8th. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.